So in this section, we're going to talk about some of the control rights that are associated with a preferred stock round. We've just spent time talking about the valuation rights, the overview of valuation, how that works, as well as some of the economic rights that are associated with a preferred stock round that an investor will expect to receive. And so let's look at things in context right now. Up until the point of a preferred stock round, the founders, Adam and Betty, have been able to basically act unilaterally without much outside input or opposition to things that they wanted to do with their business, right? Until this point in time, they've been the sole stockholders. They've owned 100% of the stock themselves, and so because they own 100% of the stock, they could elect themselves to the board of directors. As the sole members of the board of directors, they could appoint themselves as officers, maybe CEO and COO or something like that. And as officers, they could hire and fire employees at will. Well, that's all about to change because when investors come on, they're going to expect some board representation. That way, they have some type of input on the day-to-day management of the business, the high-level management of the business, and a better understanding of what's kind of underneath the hood in their investment. When we're talking about board representation, we're talking about kind of the number and the rights and the ability that the board has. So generally speaking, we're talking about board seats or board constructions. We're talking about either a 3-person board or a 5-person board. In a 3-person board, you might have some situation where the founders have a board seat to appoint a member to, and the investors have one, and then there's an independent person that's agreeable between the two parties to serve as a third member. You also see a 5-member board, which would have 2 founder seats and 2 investor seats, and then another independent. It kind of just depends on the amount of investors that are included in the round. So believe it or not, some of these preferred stock investment rounds might be made up of numerous different investors. There will, of course, be a lead investor who's going to kind of lead the negotiations and perhaps put in the most amount of capital in the investment round, but there might be some other investors that want to have a board seat as well. So one thing that's important to think about here, and one trick that you might kind of see in the term sheet, is when we're talking about the common stockholders or the founder's seat, there's a big distinction there between whether or not that seat or one of those seats is designated to the CEO versus the common stock to vote upon. So let's say that the investors require in a 3-person board that the CEO, the then CEO, will have 1 board seat, and the investors will have 1 board seat, and that the independent party will have 1 board seat. Well, let's say that Adam is the CEO at this time. Well, because Adam is the CEO, he's only entitled to that board seat because he is CEO. That seat is reserved for the CEO. Well, if the investor and the independent director agree that Adam is not a great CEO, what they could do is they could get together and say, you know what, we're going to bring in somebody better to run the business that we think is going to be a better CEO. What ends up happening? That CEO is now going to join the board. And so that board will now be comprised of the new CEO, the investor, and the independent. What happened? Adam and Betty might own a majority of the company at this point in time, but they still lost a board seat. Why? Because that seat was tied to a CEO position as opposed to a founder or as opposed to the vote of the common stockholders. So the impact and the construction on board seats is really important. It's important to kind of see the details there because it also impacts who the officers will be. Let's talk about protective provisions. So protective provisions are basically the rights that an investor bargains for to be included in the charter or included in some side letters that basically say, here are the rights that we want to be able to veto. Right? If you're going to do these types of things, you're going to have to get the approval of a certain percentage of the preferred stock. These are major transactions or major events, major changes, such as amending the charter or the bylaws. Again, the charter is the core document for a corporation. It sets forth the major governance rights. The bylaws also include major governance rights as well. So if the common stockholders could unilaterally change these documents, they could fundamentally change the scope and the nature of the investor's investment and their rights to create and issue new stock. So if the common stockholders can unilaterally, or the board and the common stockholders can unilaterally create and issue new stock, they could create preferred stock with a preference over the current preferred stockholders, which could hurt their investment. Sell the business. Perhaps they want to sell it at a price that isn't profitable for those investors. Change the size of the board. Maybe they want to add 5 more board seats and then appoint them with just with members voted upon by the common stockholders. They might also want to put limits on borrowing. So like a certain amount of money, they can't borrow a certain amount of money without the approval of a certain percentage of the preferred stockholders. We talked about earlier the fact that these preferred stockholders might include numerous different investors, which might include a lead investor and a few other follow-on investors that are part of the deal there. And so what you're generally going to see is that preferred stock percentage is often going to be tied to the percentage that's owned by the lead investor. That way the lead investor can veto these changes. Another set of rights that these investors will expect is information and inspection rights. Investors will want the right to see financial and other information, right? They might want to be able to see the books and records. They might want to be able to see the financial reports, the profit and loss statements, the balance sheets. So this is really going to create a new territory for the startup, which might not have the most sophisticated financial system structures in place. So they're going to have to kind of mature very quickly in order to handle these quarterly financial reports and make sure that the financials that they're delivering to investors are accurate. Also, we're going to talk about drag-along and tag-along rights, which are additional rights that investors are going to negotiate for. Drag-along rights basically say that if a certain percentage of the stockholders want to sell the company, then they can force the other stockholders to sell their shares as well. They can drag them along to sell. So let's say that 51% of the stockholders agree to sell the company and 49 do not. They can technically force those dissenting stockholders to sell their shares. Similar, a little bit different here is the tag-along rights. Basically, what tag-along rights is, they give the investor the right to also participate in any sale of stock. So if Adam and Betty can find a buyer who's ready, willing, and able to purchase their shares, the investors will be offered the same rights to sell their shares at the same price. That way, even if Adam and Betty are getting a little bit of liquidity, those investors will be able to get a little bit of liquidity as well. One of the last sets of economic rights or control rights that we're going to talk about here are rights of first refusal. A right of first refusal is often called a preemptive right or a pro-rata right. It's basically the right to invest in the next round to the extent that those investors are able to keep their percentage ownership immediately before that round. So if they're at 20%, then they can participate in the next round of financing in order for them to keep their 20%. This sounds good. Why would you not want your investors to keep investing? Well, it is good, but it can dilute the founders even more. Because as we've discussed earlier, investors in every single round are going to be thinking in terms of percentage that they expect to own. So if the investors in the Series A round own 20% and have a pro rata, the investors in the Series B round also want 20%, that's going to dilute the earlier investors in the Series A round. But if they also get a pro rata to get to 20% again and buy more stock to get up to 20%, that's going to dilute the founders and the employees as well. So it does kind of fall on the founders. So it's something to kind of negotiate a little bit on the scope of the right of first refusal. So that concludes our discussion on management and control rights that an investor is going to negotiate with and expect in a preferred stock round. So hopefully you were able to kind of use this information for better expectations as to what to expect when you receive a term sheet for a preferred or priced stock round. And until next time, venture awaits.